Thank you, Chairman Cruz. Let me just quickly ask three more questions, and then I'm going to conclude if I can. I wanted to follow up a little bit on this idea that ideology is a trigger to violence, and how aggressively or actively we should be going after an ideology rather than actions based on an ideology that Mr. McCarthy suggested. And Mr. McCarthy, I may have misunderstood, but I thought I heard you say that the expansion of the First Amendment in cases during the 1960s to protect radical ideas was a mistake. Is that correct?
I did say that, yes.
Okay. Then let me just, if I could, Mr. Cohen, because
Do you want me to explain what I meant by it, or?
Very concisely, if you would.
Sure. They carved out an exception for the advocacy of ideology that calls for the violent overthrow of the United States, as if there were a firm difference between advocating it and inciting it, which I think has been much more difficult to apply than perhaps they thought.
Mr. Cohen, you've dedicated most of your life to the pursuit of finding and closing down those who engage in not just dangerous ideology, but dangerous actions against other Americans. And Senator Sessions had some interesting, curious comments on the central role of the Southern Poverty Law Center in pushing back against the Klan. And you previously made a point that, just because groups like the Klan, or I would suggest the Lord's Resistance Army, a horrific terrorist group in Central Africa, just because they miscite the Bible, we wouldn't refer to them as radical Christians, and we are similarly making a mistake here if we demonize Islam as radical Islam. Help me understand, in your view, whether we should be engaging in widespread surveillance of the Muslim community, and whether we should be indulging the proposals of some candidates for president in uniform bars on Muslim admission to the United States, or patrols of so-called Muslim neighborhoods in an effort to contain a dangerous ideology. Where do you think that boundary lies between appropriate investigation of those who might have a proclivity to violence and demeaning an entire religion?
I think we're on a very slippery slope and a very, very dangerous one. If I could respond to one thing that Mr. McCarthy said, and perhaps that will put it into context, the abstract advocacy of violence in our country is constitutionally protected speech. What's not protected is, stealing a group and preparing a group for violence. The first is protected by the First Amendment. The latter is a conspiracy, a criminal conspiracy. I think that if we don't hold that distinction sacred, our country will be in trouble. I think that some of the implicit suggestions that we should surveil entire communities are not only ineffective but wildly un-American, and I can't believe that we would countenance that kind of activity in our country. I think it would drive. I think it would more likely drive terrorism than it would root it out.
That is exactly the challenge I think Senator Klobuchar was referencing in her home community, the challenge of striking a balance between investigating, prosecuting those very few individuals who are committed to acts of violence and breaking up conspiracies, and engaging the much broader Muslim community that is loyal and wants to fully enjoy the freedoms of the United States. And without their partnership and effective intervention of that very small number of folks who want to turn an ideology into an action, is really going to be at some risk. Ms. Kara, there was a previous exchange about the importance of removing from training manuals information that was just bigoted and wildly misleading. If you just renew the point, you asserted in your testimony that stigmatizing and marginalizing an entire community based on their faith both chills our First Amendment and also puts us at risk, because it frays the very relationship between law enforcement and millions of Americans. Would you just elaborate on that for a moment?
Yeah, sure. And specifically on your last point, I think the concern is that if you create mistrust between law enforcement in our communities, people are going to be reluctant to interact with law enforcement and potentially report crimes. And so that means people who are engaging in potential crimes are not going to be caught and brought to justice. So I think there's a real public safety concern there. And specifically, just to kind of tease out what that the concern is that these these materials were basically setting up a situation where it was calling for either innocuous activity or religiously First Amendment protected activity to now be seen as an indicator of violence. So, for example, growing a beard, attending a mosque or a prayer group were specific items and behaviors that were listed in an FBI intelligence product as being a so-called indicator of violence.
So in other words, actions that could equally be indicators of being a faithful Muslim,
Correct.
or in some people's perspectives could be seen as a gradual movement towards radicalization. Removing that from a training manual makes it more likely that law enforcement agents trying to understand Islam will not make the mistake of assuming that all Muslims are radicalized and are inclining towards a violent ideology.
That is correct.
Is that your basic assertion?
That's
Thank you.
correct.
Mr. German, last, if I might just close with you. So the assertion's been made indirectly and then directly that the Obama administration has literally put American lives at risk because of political correctness, or even worse, that career law enforcement agents, because of a fear of somehow being politically incorrect, stepped back from doing their job to keep Americans safe. In the instance of Omar Mateen, he was surveilled several times by FBI agents, both directly and indirectly, undercover agents and folks who were sent in to try and see what he might commit to or what he might do. There's two different possible theories of the case here. One is that the Obama administration is disloyal, treasonous, and putting America's safety at risk, and so willfully said, we're not going to take any actions against this dangerous radical. I find that disrespectful to what I know of those in state and local and federal law enforcement I've worked with for many years, who frankly, when they see a clear threat to public safety, don't care about political correctness, they care about doing their job. An alternative theory would be that despite repeated attempts to build a credible case against this individual, he didn't bite. He didn't take action, he didn't actually begin a conspiracy, he didn't take proffered offers of opportunities in a way that allowed agents to build a real case against him and proceed. And as Senator Klobuchar indicated, in one of the largest Muslim American communities in America, they have taken case after case after case to trial and actually successfully prosecuted those who took steps to participate in conspiracies. First, does it seem credible to you that career law enforcement agents look the other way out of a concern for political correctness? Or does it seem more credible to you that a deeply disturbed individual who was at different times saying he supported or was involved with groups that are literally fighting each other on the battlefield, was not taking enough credible steps to develop a working case? And then second, New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton recently said that wide-scale surveillance programs like an NYPD program that targeted the Muslim community failed to produce a single piece of actionable intelligence and frankly didn't work. I'd be interested in your comment on how we could strengthen the hand of federal and local law enforcement to keep us safe.
On your first question, I do believe the men and women of the FBI are doing everything possible under the law to try to protect us from threats. And in the cases where red flags are raised, investigations actually were pursued. My concern is they're not looking for the right thing. They're not looking for indicators of violence. They're looking for indicators of radicalization, depending on whatever model that is. And in some of these cases, what we see is those clear models are not accurate. And I also agree on the issue with Chief Bratton, where the broad surveillance of entire communities dilutes the ability to actually focus on real threats. And I think that's why, during the period those programs were in place, Najibul Azazi and Faisal Shahzad cases were missed because they were looking too broadly rather than focusing on real threats. In both those cases, they traveled overseas to terrorist training camps. That's something that maybe we should put more resources in rather than surveilling innocent Muslims. And
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank the whole panel for your testimony, the members of this committee who've engaged today. I do think we have important and unresolved questions about how to keep Americans safe, how to strengthen the hand of federal, state, and local law enforcement, but in a way that respects our most fundamental values and doesn't come up against the boundaries of cherished First Amendment freedoms. And I frankly think whether you call it radical Islam, radical Islamism, Islamic extremism, spending 3 hours arguing about these semantics, in my view, hasn't really moved us any closer towards developing new and more effective ways to combat terror and to defeat ISIS. And I look forward to the upcoming hearing where we will have Secretary Jay Johnson here, and we can both ask more pointed questions about the Department of Homeland Security and the strategy we will all follow going forward. Let me just close by saying that I am deeply troubled by proposals in our current election season. Proposals made by Mr. Trump to ban all Muslims from coming to the United States. Proposals made to keep a list of all Muslims in the United States, to actively and aggressively surveil mosques, to patrol so-called Muslim neighborhoods, I think are profoundly unhelpful as we try to respect America's constitutional traditions and keep our country safe. And I frankly worry that proposals such as these and the broad following they seem to have gotten harken back to some of the worst chapters in American history. In particular, I'll just remind us that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, this great nation turned its back on Japanese Americans, forcing the relocation and incarceration in camps of over 100,000 people based solely on their Japanese ancestry, not based on any actions taken or any expression of intent to harm Americans or to be disloyal to the United States. And the majority of those, in turn, were American citizens. As I prepared for today's hearing, I could not forget a meeting I had with the daughter of Fred Korematsu, whose name was given to a signal U.S. Supreme Court case. I met his daughter at a ceremony at the White House. And in 1983, when Mr. Korematsu's conviction for violating the internment order was finally overturned, he said, and I quote, "I would like to see the government admit they were wrong and do something about it so this will never happen again to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color." It is my hope that in this debate and in this election season, we will set aside proposals that seem more in keeping with the errors made in the past, where we went after entire groups of American citizens regardless of their substantive actions, and that we would instead live up to our core constitutional commitments and creed and find the right balance between respecting constitutional liberties, welcoming all Americans of whatever background, and finding a bipartisan path forward that will genuinely keep Americans safe. Thank you.